Welcome, dear listener, to this gentle journey through a quieter corner of history, where we will step softly into the world that emerged in the years after the Black Death. Not in the chaos and fear that so often fill its telling, but in the stillness that came after, when the last tolling of the church bell faded into the air and the roads lay empty under a pale sky. Here, we will walk slowly through deserted village streets where the wooden shutters remain closed, past overgrown. Gardens where wildflowers have replaced cabbages, and out into the wide fields where sheep graze untended beneath drifting clouds. We will hear the faint creak of a gate in the wind, the distant splash of a water mill still turning, and the occasional sound of a hammer as a survivor repairs a roof or mends a cart. We will move gently from place to place, never in haste, lingering, over the changes that unfolded not in a day or a year, but across long decades. As people learn to live again in a smaller, slower world, we will see how the empty spaces in markets were slowly filled by returning traders, how the bells of half-filled churches rang over fewer rooftops, how wages rose quietly as labor became scarce, and how fields and houses changed hands in the quiet of stone halls. We will follow the seasons as they turn, the green hush of spring, the golden harvest shared among fewer hands, the crisp air of winter evenings when families gathered by the fire to speak the names of those they had lost. And in each scene we visit, we will pause, noticing not only the events themselves, but the textures and scents and gentle sounds of life resettling into place. Here, there is no rush to reach the end, no loud clash of armies or sudden upheaval, only the slow rebuilding of towns. The gradual return of laughter at a feast table, the soft murmur of neighbors exchanging news in a village square. We will remember that history is not always made in great battles or bold declarations, but often in the quiet persistence of people carrying on with their days, sowing seed in an untended field, repairing a crumbling wall, baking bread to share with a friend. So settle in, let the pace be slow, and imagine yourself walking with me along those grass-lined roads, hearing the distant bleat of sheep and the rustle of wind through the hedgerows, watching as a world profoundly changed by loss begins, step by step, to live again. This is not the story of the plague itself, but of the spaces it left behind, and of how they were filled once more by human hands and voices, until life, though different, found its way forward. It was some weeks after the last peal of the warning. Bell had faded into the air when the wind became the only voice in the streets. The houses stood just as they had through the long months of sickness, but their shutters were closed, their doors unlatched by no hand. The cobbles underfoot, once warmed by the footsteps of traders and children, had cooled into a kind of stillness that seemed to sink into the stone itself. Those who remained had learned to move quietly. At first, they stepped outside as though the air itself might still be dangerous. A face would appear at the corner of a doorway, eyes scanning the lane for signs of another soul. Sometimes, seeing no one, the person would simply draw back inside again. Other times, they would step out, slowly, as if testing whether the world beyond the threshold still existed. In those early weeks, the air had a different sound. The markets were gone, their wooden stalls leaning in the wind, and without the murmur of voices you could hear things you might not have noticed before. The creak of a distant signboard on its rusted hinges, the faint trickle of water through the gutter channels, the call of crows circling above the church tower. Here and there, a door would open to let out a thin trail of smoke. It would curl upward into the pale sky, a sign that someone inside had begun to cook again, to warm their hearth, to return to the simplest rhythms of living. A pot left unused for months would be filled once more, and the scent of broth, faint and shy, would drift into the street. The church bells no longer rang in alarm, only in small, slow notes to mark the hours. Their sound carried further now. Without the bustle of carts and hoofbeats, the chimes seemed to linger in the air like ripples on still water. Even those who could not see the church tower could feel its presence through the sound. It was not a fearful quiet. Not anymore. But it was a quiet that carried memory. Every shuttered window seemed to remember the hands that had closed it. Every empty bench in the square seemed to recall the people who had once sat there. Those who remained often walked with their heads slightly lowered, as though listening more to the ground than to the air. They spoke softly to one another, even when close, their words accompanied by the sound of the breeze brushing over empty thresholds. The animals, too, seemed to notice the change. Cats moved along the walls in slow, unhurried steps, unbothered by people. Birds roosted in places they had once avoided, like the beams of open workshops or the shelves inside abandoned shops. Even the wind seemed to move differently now, slipping. Through narrow lanes without resistance, there was, despite everything, a faint beginning of life again. A child's laugh might be heard once in a day, faint and quick before fading. A hammer might sound from somewhere down the road, its strikes irregular, as if the person wielding it had not yet grown used to working again. And yet, most of the days passed like this, slowly, quietly, with long stretches of stillness between the rare moments of human sound. The people were there, but they were like seeds just under the soil, waiting for the warmth to return before they could push up or down. It would be a long time before the streets filled again. For now, the world was content to breathe in soft, careful breaths and to let the silence stretch like a calm tide over the land. The bells would ring again, and voices would return. But in these first months after the storm had passed, the silence was a thing in itself, not empty, but resting. And so the days turned one after another, under pale skies and cool winds. The streets remained still, the houses patient. The people moved slowly, quietly, in the knowledge that they were beginning again, though no one yet knew what this beginning would bring. The fields lay quiet in the months after the last toll. Of the warning bell, their edges soft with the growth of plants no hand had tended. Once, these fields had been neat and certain, lines of wheat running in golden rows, gardens edged with herbs, orchards neatly trimmed to keep their branches within reach of a ladder. Now they were something different. The wheat had gone uncut. The summer before, the stalks growing too tall, then bending under their own weight before the seed fell back to the soil. Grass and thistle had crept in, taking the spaces where vegetables had once grown in orderly beds. Nettles rose high along the edges of fences, and in places where a gate had broken, wildflowers had seeded themselves freely, turning paths into soft carpets of green and pale color dot in the mornings. When the mist lay low over the land, you could hardly see the old patterns at all. The furrows were blurred, the once straight hedgerows broken where briars had pulled them apart. From a distance, it was hard to tell one man's plot from another's. The boundaries, so carefully marked in the years before, were hidden beneath a layer of growth. Sheep wandered between them without care, their wool damp from the dew, nosing through the weeds for what clover they could find. Here and there, a cow grazed untethered, her bell giving a faint note as she moved. Without the regular hands of herder and milker, she had grown half-wild, lifting her head to watch any passerby with wide, curious eyes. The air smelled different, too. It no longer carried the warm scent of cut hay or the sharp tang of fresh-turned earth. Instead, it was heavy with the sweetness of grass left too long, the resin of wild herbs crushed underfoot, and the faint, damp scent of moss on stones. The farms that had once been measured in harvest yields now gave their produce to no one in particular, berries that fell to the ground uneaten, apples that dropped and browned in the grass, beans that dried in their pods and scattered there. Seeds with the wind. It was not waste in the way people thought of waste. It was simply the land keeping its own rhythms, no longer tied to the work of human hands. Sometimes, a figure would appear at the edge of one of these fields, a survivor returning to see what remained. They would stand for a long while, looking. Over the tangle of growth, the leaning fences, the empty sheds, there was no rush to reclaim it. The ground was still theirs, or would be if they wished it. But the act of farming again was not something to be decided in a single glance. The tools might still be in the barn, but they were rusted now, the handles rough with neglect. A plow left in the open stood with its blade half buried in the soil, the wooden beam softened by rain. Wild animals had begun to move into spaces where they had not dared before. Deer grazed at the edges of gardens, pausing only when they heard the faint crunch of a footstep. Rabbits burrowed under fences, leaving neat holes that led to burrows. Lined with grass, birds had taken the rafters of abandoned barns, their nests woven from bits of straw and wool, their soft calls echoing in the quiet. Even the insects seemed bolder. Bees moved freely among blossoms that would once have been picked, and the hum of their work was one of the few constant sounds in the long summer days. There was a kind of beauty to it, though it was not the beauty of the orderly, tilled land. It was softer, less deliberate, shaped by the wind and the rain rather than by the straight furrow of a plow. The colors were more varied than they had been before. Deep greens tangled with bright yellows, the pale blues of field flowers. Among the faded brown of last year's stalks, it was a place both alive and strangely empty, where the signs of abundance and absence lived side by side. The people who ventured out into these fields walked slowly, sometimes gathering a handful of berries or pulling a weed from the path out of old habit. But most often, they simply looked, letting their eyes follow the slow movement of clouds over the open land, hearing the faint rustle of wind in the tall grass. They knew, perhaps without saying it aloud, that it would be a long while before the fields returned to the way they had been, and maybe they would never return in quite the same way. Too much had shifted. The fields, like the people, would grow back differently now. In time, the land would be worked again. Seeds would be planted, animals kept in pasture, and the gardens would be tended. But for now, the fields rested, green and untidy, under the long light of summer. They did not ask for anything, nor did they give in the measured ways they once had. They simply were stretching out beyond the village, carrying the quiet forward into another season, letting the wind be the only hand to pass over them. There are places where the road bends and the hedgerows open, and if you were to pass by quickly, you might never guess that a village once stood there. The land holds its shape softly, as though time has been smoothing the edges for years, and yet if you walk slowly enough, you might notice certain signs. A low rise where a wall once stood, a patch of ground where the grass grows differently, as if remembering the weight of a building long gone. These vanished villages were not swept away in a single moment, but rather faded quietly, their people gone, their roofs sinking, their stones left for moss to keep dot in the months and years after the plague. Such places became more common. Some had lost nearly every soul, and those who survived found it easier to move to another settlement than to keep a place alive alone. A row of cottages might stand empty for a season, then for two, until the thatch sagged and the shutters loosened. A well might still hold water, though no one came to draw it. Paths once worn smooth by daily footsteps grew rough again, stones shifting beneath the slow creep of grass. Even the air felt different in such places, stiller, as though it had not been stirred by voices in a long while. Nature's work here was not hurried. The first years brought weeds through cracks in the paving, ivy testing the edges of stone walls. Birds began to nest in the eaves, and small animals moved into what had once been kitchens and storerooms. Then the larger changes followed. Roofs collapsing inward during heavy rains, timbers softening under the long touch of damp. Beams that once held up the weight of a home now lying in a heap, softened by moss. Orchards went wild without pruning, their branches twisting, fruit falling unpicked. The gardens behind the houses grew into thickets, the neat paths gone, their lines hidden beneath brambles and nettles. Sometimes a traveler would stop in one of these empty villages for shelter, lighting a fire in the shell of a building and leaving by morning without disturbing much else. They might notice a carved lintel above a doorway, a mark in the stone that meant something to someone once, though its meaning was now lost. They might find a broken pot half buried in soil or a hint rusted to the point of being part of the earth itself. These traces were all that remained of the life once lived here, and they asked for no explanation. They simply were silent witnesses to the passing of people and the patience of the land in some places. the church still stood when all else had fallen. Its tower, visible across the fields, became a landmark for miles around, even if no service had been held there in years. Grass might grow waist-high around the doorway, and the bell rope might be frayed and brittle, but the stone endured. Sometimes, in the still of an autumn afternoon, a gust of wind would move through the empty space where the door had been, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and old wood. And if you stood there long enough, you might imagine the echo of a voice inside, though it would only be the wind's way of speaking through hollow places. Those who passed by these villages did not always speak of them. There was a quiet respect for such places, a sense that they belonged to a time just out of reach. To linger too long among the fallen walls could feel as though you were stepping into someone else's dream. Yet, in another way, they became part of the landscape's rhythm. In spring, wildflowers filled the empty lanes. In summer, bees moved through the overgrown gardens. In autumn, the fruit trees dropped their harvest into the tall grass, feeding deer and birds alike. And in winter, the snow lay undisturbed on roofs that no one cleared. Years might pass before the land was used again. Sometimes a new generation would build nearby, reusing the stones of the old walls for their own cottages, carrying a little of the vanished place into the future. Other times, the site would be left entirely, becoming nothing more than a green field where sheep grazed. The memory of the village held only in a name written on a fading map. And there were those whose names faded even from the maps, leaving behind only the faintest of signs, a line of trees where a lane once ran, a mound that marked where the hall had stood. The villages that vanished did not vanish in anger, or fire, or a great noise. They simply slipped into the quiet piece by piece, until the silence became complete. And in that silence, the land folded them into itself, not erasing them, but keeping them gently, as though waiting for someone to come. And notice the way the earth still holds the shape of what was once there. It began quietly, almost without anyone noticing at first. A figure appearing at the bend in the road, walking slowly, carrying little more than a bundle slung across one shoulder. A small cart, its single wheel creaking, drawn by a weary donkey. A family of 3, the child held between the 2 adults. All 3 stepping with the cautious pace of people who have been away too long. These were the survivors returning, not in a rush, but in a slow and scattered drift, coming back to the places they had once called home. Many had left in fear, retreating to the countryside or to the houses of distant relatives, carrying what they could manage in the uncertainty of those dark months. Now, as the seasons turned without the shadow that had so recently lingered over every lane and field, they began to make their way back. They came in 2s and 3s, sometimes alone, pausing at the edges of villages before walking in fully, as though testing the air. The roads they had known so well were overgrown in places, their landmarks softened by months of neglect. A milestone might be hidden behind a curtain of ivy, a fence they had once leaned against now lying in the grass. But the paths still led home, even if the homes themselves had changed. When they stepped through familiar gates or crossed the threshold of a long-closed door, the first thing that struck them was the stillness inside. Rooms smelled of dust and wood that had not been warmed in months. A forgotten cloth lay stiff on a table, its colors faded. Ash lay cold in the hearth, the shape of its last fire still visible in the gray. For a moment, it was as if time had stopped inside the walls. And then, with a small movement, the lifting of a latch, the scraping of a chair across the floor, life began to flow back into the space. Fires were lit again. Carefully at first, the flames hesitant as they took to the dry wood. Smoke began to curl from chimneys that had been cold for a year or more, and neighbors who had already returned would notice it and come to stand in the lane, watching. They would call softly to the new arrivals, and there was often a pause before the reply came, the sound of voices unused to speaking across open air after so much silence. Soon there were footsteps on floors that had not felt them for many seasons. Doors opening to let in light, windows pushed wide so that the breeze could carry the old dust away. There was work to be done, but it was not hurried. Roofs needed mending where thatch had sagged, hinges needed oiling, gardens needed clearing. Each task was done in its own time, often with breaks for long looks at the sky, or for leaning on a fence to speak with someone else who had just returned. The sound of hammers striking nails became a kind of slow heartbeat for the village, joined now and then by the rhythmic scrape of a saw or the muted ring of a bucket being lowered into a well. Even small sounds, a broom sweeping, the clang of a pan, felt significant because they marked the shift from stillness to life. Children returned in a way that was different from adults. They explored first, running ahead to see if a favorite tree was still standing, or if the lane where they once played still held its puddles after rain. They were quicker to settle in, turning a half-prepared space into a place for games, filling empty afternoons with the sound of their laughter. That laughter, perhaps more than anything else, marked the true return. Adults might speak in careful tones, measuring each word, but children did not weigh their voices. They filled the air without thinking, and the air welcomed them. With each returning family, the sense of separation began to lessen. A neighbor might share a loaf of bread baked in a newly warmed oven, or a jug of milk from a cow that had been found and tended. Someone might lend a tool or help set a beam in place. These were not grand gestures, but they were the quiet threads from which community is woven. The more threads there were, the stronger the fabric became, until the thought of leaving again felt less and less likely dot by evening. The villages looked different from the way they had in the first weeks after the silence. Light spilled from doorways, flickering across the lanes. The smell of cooking drifted through the air, onions, broth, sometimes the faint, warm scent of bread. Shadows moved behind windows, and voices carried from one house to another, not in shouts, but in steady conversation. It was still quiet compared to the days before the plague, but it was a living quiet now, the kind that holds the soft hum of people settling back into their own spaces. In the days that followed, more came. Sometimes they were recognized at once, sometimes not until they spoke. Faces had changed, made older by the months away, but the lines of recognition ran deep. There were moments of surprise, embraces that held longer than words could manage, tears that were not only for sadness but for the relief of seeing someone return at all. The act of returning was more than just walking back through a door. It was the slow gathering up of life where it had been left, the relearning of how to share a lane with others, how to greet a neighbor in the morning, how to hear the sound of another person's work and feel comfort rather than unease. It was the first step towards something that would not be the same as before, but would still be home. And as the nights came on, those who had returned would sit near their new lit hearths, listening to the wind move outside. The houses no longer stood in a silence that pressed inward. Now, the quiet was of a gentler kind, the kind that comes when the day's work is done and the fire is warm. They had returned, and though much had been lost, something had been found again. The simple fact of being in a place that knew them, and that they knew in return. When the first weeks of returning had passed, and the homes were warm again, and the streets no longer felt entirely hollow, attention began to turn to the work that kept a village alive. It did not happen all at once, and for a time the fields still lay tangled, the tools still resting in corners. But little by little, the people began to measure the days not only by sunrise and sunset, but by the tasks that could be done between them. And it was then they realized the work had changed. The shape of it was different now, stretched in some places, narrowed in others, as though the very rhythm of life had shifted while they were away. There were fewer hands for nearly every task. A field that once required 10 people to plow might now be tended by only 2. A weaving shed that used to hum with half a dozen looms might stand with just one in use, the others silent, their threads gathering dust. Even the simplest work, fetching water, tending a small garden, felt different. Because there were fewer people passing by to share it, fewer voices calling out greetings along the way. Those who remained quickly learned that there was more land, more space, more responsibility than before. and that each person's work carried a weight it had never quite held in the crowded years. But there was a quiet side to this change. True, the fields did not demand to be worked all at once. With fewer mouths to feed, there was less urgency to plant every corner, to harvest every grain. People could work slower, moving at the pace the day allowed. A man might begin in the morning with a patch of soil, working steadily until midday, then sit in the shade with his meal, looking out over the wide stretch of green that lay before him. He knew he would not reach it all. Not this year, perhaps. Not even the next, but there was no overseer urging him to move faster, no line of workers pressing him forward. The work became quieter, more solitary, and for some, that brought a kind of ease they had not known before. Meals, too, took on a new shape. Without the constant rush to finish before another task called, people lingered over their bread and broth, speaking in low tones, or eating in companionable silence. The midday meal, taken out in the fields, might be nothing more than a hunk of bread, a piece of cheese, and a cup of watered ale, but eaten with the slow rhythm of someone who has time enough to taste it fully. Work resumed when it felt right, the sun marking the hours more than any bell. In this way, the days began to stretch, their pace set not by the demands of many, but by the choices of the few. There were still moments of shared labor, of course. At planting time, neighbors would join to help one another lay seed in the earth, their rows long and steady, their conversation drifting easily in the open air. At harvest, the same was true, though the harvests themselves were smaller, the sheaves fewer and easier to gather. The old sense of urgency, of beating the weather, of storing enough for a crowded winter, was softened by the reality that there were fewer to provide for. Baskets filled more slowly, carts returned less heavily laden. But still there was enough, and perhaps for the first time in many years, enough felt like plenty. Craftwork followed the same pattern. The blacksmith, once busy with orders for a dozen farms, now found himself making a single plowshare in a week instead of 3 in a day. The weaver might complete one bolt of cloth in a fortnight, working only when the light was good, and the mood was right. Some days, the tools stayed idle altogether, their owners tending instead to their gardens, their animals, or even simply sitting in the sun. It was not laziness, but a recognition that the work could be balanced with the living. Of life that every hour did not need to be bent to production. This slower pace gave time for things that had once been crowded out. People began mending their own clothes instead of rushing to buy or trade for new ones. They learned to repair their own tools, to make simple items at home. Children watched and helped, learning these skills, not as urgent lessons, but as part of the gentle flow of the day. In this way, the new shape of work was passed quietly from one generation to the next, less about output and more about the steady keeping of what one had. There was still hardship, of course. Some tasks, like mending a roof or tending a large field, were simply too much for one pair of hands, and without enough neighbors to help, they could go unfinished for a season or two. Weather could still undo a day's work, and illness could leave a family short-handed. But even these challenges were met differently now, with patience instead of panic, with the understanding that what could not be done today could wait for tomorrow or the next week, without disaster. As the seasons passed, this new rhythm became the ordinary way of things. The days were quieter, the work less hurried, the evenings longer. Fires burned in hearths, not just for warmth or cooking, but for the comfort of sitting before them when the day's tasks were done. The few who lived in each place came to know their land and their work more deeply, not as an endless demand, but as a shared life. And though the fields still stretched wide and sometimes seemed almost too much for so few, they were tended with a steady, patient hand in a time when patience had become one of the most valued skills of all. There was work to be done, but it was not hurried. Roofs needed mending where thatch had sagged, hinges needed oiling, gardens needed clearing. Each task was done in its own time, often with breaks for long looks at the sky, or for leaning on a fence to speak with someone else who had just returned. The sound of hammers striking nails became a kind of slow heartbeat for the village. joined now and then by the rhythmic scrape of a saw or the muted ring of a bucket being lowered into a well. Even small sounds, a broom sweeping, the clang of a pan, felt significant because they marked the shift from stillness to life. Children returned in a way that was different from adults. They explored first, running ahead to see if a favorite tree was still standing or if the lane where they once played still held its puddles after rain. They were quicker to settle in, turning a half-repaired space into a place for games, filling empty afternoons with the sound of their laughter. That laughter, perhaps more than anything else, marked the true return. Adults might speak in careful tones, measuring each word, but children did not weigh their voices. They filled the air without thinking, and the air welcomed them. With each returning family, the sense of separation began to lessen. A neighbor might share a loaf of bread baked in a newly warmed oven, or a jug of milk from a cow that had been found and tended. Someone might lend a tool or help set a beam in place. These were not grand gestures, but they were the quiet threads from which community is woven. The more threads there were, the stronger the fabric became, until the thought of leaving again felt less and less likely dot by evening. The villages looked different from the way they had in the first weeks after the silence. Light spilled from doorways, flickering across the lanes. The smell of cooking drifted through the air, onions, broth, sometimes the faint, warm scent of bread. Shadows moved behind windows, and voices carried from one house to another, not in shouts, but in steady conversation. It was still quiet compared to the days before the plague, but it was a living quiet now, the kind that holds the soft hum of people settling back into their own spaces. In the days that followed, more came. Sometimes they were recognized at once, sometimes not until they spoke. Faces had changed, made older by the months away, but the lines of recognition ran deep. There were moments of surprise, embraces that held longer than words could manage, tears that were not only for sadness but for the relief of seeing someone return at all. The act of returning was more than just walking back through a door. It was the slow gathering up of life where it had been left, the relearning of how to share a lane with others, how to greet a neighbor in the morning, how to hear the sound of another person's work and feel comfort rather than unease. It was the first step toward something that would not be the same as before, but would still be home. And as the nights came on, those who had returned would sit near their new lit hearths, listening to the wind move outside. The houses no longer stood in a silence that pressed inward. Now, the quiet was of a gentler kind, the kind that comes when the day's work is done and the fire is warm. They had returned, and though much had been lost, something had been found again. The simple fact of being in a place that knew them, and that they knew in return, when the first weeks of returning had passed and the homes were warm again. And the streets no longer felt entirely hollow. Attention began to turn to the work that kept a village alive. It did not happen all at once, and for a time the fields still lay tangled, the tools still resting in corners. But little by little, the people began to measure the days not only by sunrise and sunset, but by the tasks that could be done between them. And it was then they realized the work had changed. The shape of it was different now, stretched. In some places, narrowed in others, as though the very rhythm of life had shifted while they were away. There were fewer hands for nearly every task. A field that once required 10 people to plow might now be tended by only 2. A weaving shed that used to hum with half a dozen looms might stand with just one in use, the others silent, their threads gathering dust. Even the simplest work, fetching water, tending a small garden, felt different. Because there were fewer people passing by to share it, fewer voices calling out greetings along the way. Those who remained quickly learned that there was more land, more space, more responsibility than before, and that each person's work carried a weight it had never quite held in the crowded years. But there was a quiet side to this change. 2. The fields did not demand to be worked all at once. With fewer mouths to feed, there was less urgency to plant every corner, to harvest every grain. People could work slower, moving at the pace the day allowed. A man might begin in the morning with a patch of soil, working steadily until midday, then sit in the shade with his meal, looking out over the wide stretch of green that lay before him. He knew he would not reach it all, not this year, perhaps, not even the next, but there was no overseer urging him to move faster, no line of workers pressing him forward. The work became quieter, more solitary, and for some, that brought a kind of ease they had not known before. Meals, too, took on a new shape. Without the constant rush to finish before another task called, people lingered over their bread and broth, speaking in low tones or eating in companionable silence. The midday meal, taken out in the fields, might be nothing more than a hunk of bread, a piece of cheese, and a cup of watered ale, but eaten with the slow rhythm of someone who has time enough to taste it fully. Work resumed when it felt right, the sun marking the hours more than any bell. In this way, the days began to stretch, their pace set not by the demands of many, but by the choices of the few. There were still moments of shared labor, of course. At planting time, neighbors would join to help one another lay seed in the earth, their rows long and steady, their conversation drifting easily in the open air. At harvest, the same was true, though the harvests themselves were smaller, the sheaves fewer and easier to gather. The old sense of urgency, of beating the weather, of storing enough for a crowded winter was softened by the reality that there were fewer to provide for. Baskets filled more slowly. Carts returned less heavily laden. But still there was enough, and perhaps for the first time in many years, enough felt like plenty. Craftwork followed the same pattern. The blacksmith, once busy with orders for a dozen farms, now found himself making a single plowshare in a week instead of 3 in a day. The weaver might complete one bolt of cloth in a fortnight, working only when the light was good and the mood was right. Some days, the tools stayed idle altogether, their owners tending instead to their gardens, their animals, or even simply sitting in the sun. It was not laziness, but a recognition that the work could be balanced with the living. Of life that every hour did not need to be bent to production. This slower pace gave time for things that had once been crowded out. People began mending their own clothes instead of rushing to buy or trade for new ones. They learned to repair their own tools, to make simple items at home. Children watched and helped, learning these skills, not as urgent lessons, but as part of the gentle flow of the day. In this way, the new shape of work was passed quietly from one generation to the next, less about output and more about the steady keeping of what one had. There was still hardship, of course. Some tasks, like mending a roof or tending a large field, were simply too much for one pair of hands, and without enough neighbors to help, they could go unfinished for a season or two. Weather could still undo a day's work, and illness could leave a family short-handed. But even these challenges were met differently now, with patience instead of panic, with the understanding that what could not be done today could wait for tomorrow or the next week without disaster. As the seasons passed, this new rhythm became the ordinary way of things. The days were quieter, the work less hurried, the evenings longer. Fires burned in hearths, not just for warmth or cooking, but for the comfort of sitting before them when the day's tasks were done. The few who lived in each place came to know their land and their work more deeply, not as an endless demand, but as a shared life. And though the field still stretched wide and sometimes seemed almost too much for so few, they were tended with a steady, patient hand, in a time when patience had become one of the most valued skills of all. On Sunday mornings, the sound of the church bell still carried across the fields, though it seemed softer than before. Not because the bell itself had changed, but because there were fewer rooftops to catch the sound, fewer ears to hear it. It rang slowly with long pauses between each note, the kind of toll that allowed the air to settle before the next strike. Those who made their way along the lanes to the church walked at an easy pace, their steps unhurried, their faces calm. There was no longer the press of a crowd moving together, no need to arrive early to find a seat. The church was never full now. There was always space on the benches, and always more quiet than words. Inside, the air was cool and still, holding the faint smell of old wood, beeswax, and stone warmed by the sun through high windows. Light fell in pale shapes on the floor, catching the dust that moved in the air like slow snow. The pews, once close packed with people, now held small clusters. A family here, an old man sitting alone there, a pair of neighbors leaning slightly toward each other to speak in low voices before the service began. The empty spaces between them were as much a part of the gathering as the people themselves. Gaps that spoke of those who were gone and of the quiet that remained. The priest, too, had adjusted to the new shape of things. His voice carried more easily now. He did not have to lift it to reach the farthest corner. He read the familiar words in a tone that was steady but gentle, allowing them to rest in the stillness rather than pressing them forward. The prayers were said with pauses long enough for the creak of a bench or the soft cough of a listener to sound clear in the room. Hymns, when they were sung, rose in smaller voices but seemed to linger longer, the echoes finding more space to travel through the air. Candles burned at the front of the church, their light steady and low, and sometimes one would be lit during the service for someone who had been lost in recent years. The act was quiet, a slow step forward, the soft strike of flint, the brief flare before the wick caught, and then the flame would join the others, another small light in a long line of memory. These candles gave the church a feeling of warmth even when the air was cool, their glow reflecting faintly on the stone walls, their scent mingling with the beeswax polish on the altar rail. After the service, there was no great rush to leave. People lingered in the churchyard, speaking in small groups or attending to graves, brushing away leaves, straightening flowers that had been left the week before. The grass grew a little longer now between visits, but it was kept from overtaking the stones entirely. Names were read quietly by those who remembered them, sometimes aloud, sometimes only in the mind. It was not a place of loud grief, but of steady keeping, a tending of the past alongside the tending of the living. The half-filled churches of those years were not empty in spirit, though they were in numbers. They became places of calm rather than of crowd, where each person's presence was more noticeable, where the turning of a page could be heard by everyone. And though the services ended and the people drifted away toward their homes, the stillness remained as if the walls themselves held the quiet close, ready to offer it again when the bell next called them back. The roads that once carried the pulse of daily life had grown quieter than anyone could remember. In the years before, they had been alive from dawn to dusk, the steady clop of hooves, the rumble of carts heavy with grain, the voices of traders calling to one another as they passed. Now, in the still years after the plague, the sound was different. Grass had begun to creep along the edges of the paths, then inward, until narrow ribbons of green crossed the places where wagon wheels had once worn deep grooves. On some stretches, the grass rose high enough to brush against the knees of anyone walking through, swaying gently in the wind as if claiming the ground for itself. Along these roads, the air seemed to move differently, without the constant churn of traffic. The dust that once hung in the sunlight had settled, leaving the ground firm and quiet beneath the feet. You could hear things now that the road had always hidden: the delicate rustle of a bird in the hedgerow, the faint trickle of water from a ditch, the sigh of wind through the open fields beyond. In some places, wildflowers bloomed right in the center of the path, their roots untroubled by hooves or wheels, their petals catching the morning light as if no one had ever passed there all thought there were still travelers. But they came rarely, and most went in pairs or small groups, keeping to routes they knew well. The long, straight stretches between villages could feel endless now, and the quiet pressed in from both sides. People often chose longer, winding ways rather than the most direct road, preferring the comfort of passing through inhabited places, even if it meant adding hours to the journey. Some of the old inns along the main roads had closed altogether, their shutters nailed over, their signs faded and swinging in the wind. The smell of cooking and the sound of laughter no longer spilled from their doors. Instead, ivy worked its way up the walls, and the only sound was the tap of a loose shutter in the breeze. Here and there, a wayfarer's shelter still stood, a rough lean-to of wood and stone where travelers could rest for a night. These, too, had changed. Once they had been places of noisy company where merchants, messengers, and shepherds shared a meal and news of the road. Now, a lone traveler might pass the night without hearing another voice. The fire in the hearth burning low, the silence broken only by the occasional call of an owl outside. Even in their quiet, the roads held memory. A certain bend might still bear the deep rut of a long-gone wagon, now filled with rainwater and scattered with leaves. A low bridge might echo faintly when crossed, just as it had when carts rolled over it day after day. And in the minds of those who had known them in busier times, the roads were never entirely empty. They carried the ghosts of sounds and footsteps, of meetings and partings, of journeys taken for reasons now half forgotten. The overgrowth did not come all at once. It was the slow work of seasons. A summer without many travelers meant grass taking root in the dry soil. A winter without wagon wheels meant snow lying undisturbed from one end of the path to the other. By the time the roads were used again with any regularity, nature had already made herself at home. And the people who passed along them did so like guests moving through someone else's house. Yet even in this softened, altered state, the roads remained what they had always been, the quiet lines that linked one place to another, the paths by which news and goods and faces might still arrive. They no longer roared with the life of the past, but they still breathed, slowly, patiently, waiting for the day when footsteps and wheels would return in greater number. Until then, the grass grew, the flowers opened, and the wind moved freely across their length, carrying a gentle hum of the changed world in the years after the great sickness had passed. The sound of children's voices was one of the rarest things in many villages. Before, they had been everywhere, running along the lanes in barefoot games, shouting to one another across the fields, crowding in doorways to watch travelers pass. Now, in many places, a single child might wander down a whole street without meeting another. It was not that joy had vanished, but that it was softer, more scattered, like a candle seen from far away. Those who were born in the years just after the plague grew up in a world that felt wider and quieter than the one their parents had known. Small gatherings still happened. In some villages, a handful of children would meet in a green at the center, where the grass had grown thick from years without much trampling. They played games their parents remembered from long ago, passing down rhymes and rules without fully knowing their origins. But the games moved more slowly now, and when one child grew tired and went home, the others sometimes found there were not enough of them to keep it going. This did not seem to trouble them much. They were used to solitary play, building little structures from stones and twigs, or following the slow path of a beetle through the dust, schools where they existed, or smaller too. A teacher might stand before a room of only a few pupils, their voices reciting lessons in turns, one after the other. The gaps between each child's words felt almost like the silences between church bells, long enough to notice the wind moving through the cracks in the shutters, or the rustle of paper as the teacher turned a page. For some children, learning came from their parents instead, often folded into the work of the day, counting while stacking firewood, practicing letters scratched into the dirt, measuring flour for bread. The world beyond their homes felt more open to them than it had for their elders. Fewer people meant fewer barriers to where a child might wander, and many grew up with the fields, streams, and woods as their playground. They learned the sound of the river in every season, the way the light shifted across the hills, the taste of berries from hedgerows their parents had once passed without noticing. They became quiet observers of the land, able to name the birds that nested nearby, or to tell from a cloud shape how soon the rain would come down. Yet, even in their freedom, there was an absence they could sense without fully understanding. When their parents spoke of the great fairs that had once filled the roads with noise and color, or of harvest feasts where long tables stretched the length of the green, the children would listen with a kind of wondering disbelief. They could not imagine such a crowd, nor what it might feel like to be surrounded by more voices than one could count. Their own lives were measured in smaller gatherings, shorter walks, and the gentle repetition of familiar faces as they grew. They carried this quiet with them. They were more comfortable with pauses in conversation, more at ease with stillness. They worked steadily when work was needed, but they did not hurry. Perhaps without knowing it, they were shaped by the slower rhythm of their world, and in turn, they shaped the years that followed, keeping some of that calm even as the roads, markets, and fields slowly began to fill again. For the children of the plague years, the memory of a less crowded world would always remain, not as a sadness, but as a gentle undercurrent, a reminder of the days when the wind in the trees was the loudest sound of all Dot in the years after. The plague? The land did not remain still, even if the people upon it moved more slowly. Fields that had once been worked by the same families for generations now stood untended, their owners gone. Villages with half their homes empty found that the boundaries between one person's plot and another's began to blur. It was not always a matter of formal decisions at first. Sometimes a neighbor simply began planting in a field that had been left bare for 2 seasons, and no one objected. The rhythm of life required food, and the land could not be left to waste if there were hands willing to tend it. In some cases, the changes were more official. Local lords, suddenly faced with wide stretches of farmland and too few tenants to work them, offered favorable terms to anyone willing to take up the task. A man who had once rented a single strip of land might find himself offered 2, or even 3, for the same rent he had paid before. Some took the opportunity gladly, feeling a quiet pride at having more to their name than their fathers had ever dreamed. Others hesitated, knowing that more land meant more work, and that the labor shortage made every extra acre a challenge to keep in good order. The great estates suffered as much as the small farms. Nobles accustomed to collecting rents from dozens of households found that half their income had vanished. Where once there had been a steward to oversee each section of land, now one might be responsible for 3 or 4. Repairs to walls. Barns and mills were delayed, sometimes for years, as there were not enough craftsmen to go around. A sense of weariness settled over some of these large properties, as though the stones themselves understood that their upkeep had fallen to fewer and fewer hands. For the people who took over abandoned land, the change could feel both liberating and heavy. A man might walk the boundary of his newly gained fields at dusk, looking at the hedgerows with a quiet satisfaction, imagining the crops that could grow there. Yet he would also know that each stretch of ground would need plowing, sowing, and harvesting, and that if the weather turned or illness came, there would be fewer neighbors to call upon for help. The gain was real, but so was the solitude it brought. Inheritance became a matter of unexpected turns. A cousin living miles away might receive word that he now owned a plot of land he had never seen, passed to him because no closer kin remained. Some of these new owners came to settle, breathing life into half-empty villages. Others sold their holdings to those already nearby, preferring to stay in their own familiar homes. In this way, land slowly shifted from hand to hand, often more. Then once within a decade, the church too gained land, as pious owners left property in their wills for the sake of their souls. Fields belonging to monasteries or parish churches were sometimes leased back to villagers at low rent, creating a quiet cycle where the land's produce supported both the people and the religious houses. In some regions, these church lands became some of the best tended, as the stability of the institution allowed for long-term care even in uncertain times. Not all transfers were peaceful. Disputes arose when 2 families claimed the same abandoned plot, each saying they had a right to it through some forgotten agreement or distant relation. Such arguments could stretch on for years, with the land lying idle between seasons, as the matter was discussed and rediscussed in the manor court. Yet more often there was a kind of unspoken understanding that it was better for anyone, to work the land than for it to go to waste. Over time, these quiet shifts began to reshape the countryside. Fields that had once been scattered, strips belonging to many families, were sometimes gathered into large, more continuous plots, easier to work with fewer laborers. In other places, land was divided more finely, giving even the humblest household a small patch of its own. The old patterns of ownership, which had seemed so fixed for generations, now proved to be as changeable as the weather. Walking through the countryside, one might not notice the difference at first glance. The hedges still lined the fields. The same streams still marked the boundaries. But the hands that tended each acre were not always the same as before, and the stories tied to each patch of soil had subtly changed. Behind every shift lay a chain of quiet decisions. An agreement struck in a cold stone hall, a handshake over a fence, a silent choice to plant in a field whose owner would not be returning. And so the land moved, not with the sudden force of battle or conquest, but with the slow, persistent flow of everyday necessity. Each transfer carried with it the hopes of the new owner and the shadow of the one who had left. In time, the new hands became the familiar ones, and the boundaries felt as though they had always been so until another season, another absence. Began the process again for years after the plague. The great feasts that had once filled village greens and town squares existed only in memory. People still spoke of them in the quiet hours, of cables that seemed to stretch endlessly, of the smell of roasting meat drifting across the fields, of music that played until the stars were high. But the spaces where such gatherings had taken place were now used for simpler purposes. The green became a place to dry laundry in the sun or to pasture a few sheep. The long tables were gone, and so were many of the hands that had once prepared them. Yet, slowly, almost without notice, the idea of coming together began to return. It began in small ways. A family might invite a neighbor to share the evening meal, just to fill the quiet of the long dark. Two households might join together for the harvest, their children running between them with jugs of water or baskets of bread. These were not feasts in the grand sense, but they carried the same spirit, the pleasure of sitting close to others, of hearing laughter mingle with the sound of spoons against bowls, of letting the day's labor fade into warmth and conversation. The first true gatherings were tied to necessity. At harvest time, there was more grain than one family could thresh alone, more apples than one orchard keeper could store. Neighbors came to help, and afterward, they stayed to eat what could not be kept. In those early feasts, the fare was simple. Fresh bread, cheese, whatever meat could be spared. But the sharing mattered more than the menu. The food was laid out on low tables or even on clean boards across barrels, and people stood as they ate, talking softly of the year's work and the plans for the next. With each passing season, the gatherings grew a little larger. Someone would bring a fiddle. Someone else would sing a song their grandmother had taught them. The music was gentle, unhurried, and often children would fall asleep against their parents' sides before the evening was through. Candles in iron holders flickered in the breeze, and the shadows they cast swayed across faces that were smiling more easily than they had in years. These small feasts carried a sense of cautious joy. No one had forgotten how quickly life could change. But there was comfort in seeing familiar faces in one place, in hearing the murmur of many voices at once. Even the simplest food seemed to taste better when eaten together. People lingered, longer than they needed to, reluctant to let the warmth of company fade back into the solitary quiet of home. Over time, the old traditions began to return, though in gentler form. The May gatherings were not as crowded as before, but there were flowers woven into garlands, and someone would always bring out a jug of cider. At Christmastide, there might be a shared loaf spiced with cinnamon, saved for weeks for the occasion. The scale was smaller, the noise softer, but the heart of the feast was still there, the sense of belonging to something larger than oneself. Children born after the plague often found these gatherings almost magical. For them, the sight of so many people in one place was rare, and they would watch in wonder as their parents laughed and traded stories with neighbors. They learned the old songs and games during these evenings, carrying them home like treasures, to be remembered and repeated in the seasons ahead. By the time a decade had passed, the feasts were no longer unusual. They had settled into the rhythm of the year once more, marking the turning of the seasons with shared meals and gentle merriment. The largest of them still could not match the scale of the old days, but no one seemed to mind. The joy was in the return itself, in the knowledge that the green could once again echo with music, that the smell of baking bread could carry across the village, That laughter could rise into the night air and be met with more laughter in these moments. People felt the threads of their community weaving together again, slowly but surely. The feasts were more than just meals. They were a quiet declaration that life, though altered, still held space for joy. The years of silence had passed, and though the memory of them remained, it was now softened by the sound of voices raised not in mourning, but in gentle celebration. The return of life to the villages and towns after the plague brought with it not only laughter and shared meals, but also a quiet awareness among the rulers and landholders that the old ways of managing people and work could no longer be kept exactly as they were. Too much had changed. There were fewer workers now, and those who remained knew they were needed. Wages, once fixed by custom or by the will of the landowner, began to rise simply because there were not enough hands to do the work. Those who had once labored for the smallest of coins could now ask for more, and in many places, they received it. But not all those in power welcomed this new balance, and so the slow, deliberate machinery of law began to turn. It started with proclamations read in the open air, where the villagers could gather to listen. A clerk, often wrapped against the wind, would unroll a piece of parchment, and, in a steady voice, read words sent from far away, words meant to set limits on what a man or woman could ask for their labor, words that told how much a shepherd should earn for a season's work or how many pennies a carpenter might take for repairing a roof. The laws were meant to hold wages close to what they had been before the sickness, as though the great emptiness it had left behind could be ignored. For the people hearing these decrees, the moment was a curious one. On the one hand, they understood that such rules were meant to keep order, and in some ways, order was comforting after so much upheaval. On the other, many knew they could find better pay if they walked to the next village, or to the nearest town. The roads were quiet, but they were still open, and some were willing to travel if it meant returning with heavier purses. This quiet movement of workers from place to place was not what the lawmakers desired. And so new rules were added, telling laborers they could not leave their home parish without permission, and telling landowners they must not hire someone who had run away from their rightful place. These laws, written in the halls of kings and councils, arrived slowly to the countryside. A parchment might take weeks to reach a distant manor, and by the time it was read aloud, the season's work was already underway. And even when the words were heard, not all chose to follow them strictly. In some villages, the Lord himself would turn a blind eye if higher wages meant the harvest would be brought in before the rains. In others, neighbors simply agreed in private what a fair price for work would be. Letting the official rate remain just words on a page, taxes too began to change. With fewer people to share the burden, each household was asked to give a little more, whether in coin or in grain. Some of this was used to repair roads that had fallen into disuse, or to restore buildings in the towns. Some went to the armies, for even in this quieter time, the larger world beyond the villages was still restless. The paying of taxes became another reminder that life, though altered, still had obligations that stretched beyond one's own hearth. Not all the new rules were about money. Some were meant to settle the ownership of abandoned land, to decide who might claim a field when no heir could be found. Others tried to protect the poor from being turned off their holdings by landlords seeking more profitable uses for the land. In some places, these laws were followed with fairness. In others, they were bent to favor those with greater power. As always, the written law and the lived truth could be two different things, separated by the slow, winding path between parchment and plow. The church had its own set of rules, some reinforcing the king's commands, others concerned with the spiritual order of the people. Marriages and baptisms, fewer in number after the plague, were still carefully recorded. Priests reminded their congregations that greed was a sin, even in a time when labor was worth more. Charity was encouraged, but so was obedience to the order of things. And so, in village greens and quiet chapels, the words of both king and priest mingled, each seeking to shape life in the years after the great sickness. For most people, these changes were felt more in small daily ways than in grand declarations. A man might notice that he had to travel farther to find work that paid what he wanted, or that the steward at the manor was more careful in recording his hours. A woman might see that the price she paid for flour had been fixed by decree, or that her neighbor now tilled a field granted to him by law. The world was slowly knitting itself back together, and these rules were the stitches, sometimes neat and even, sometimes crooked, but always moving forward. And yet, even with laws meant to guide them, people still found ways to live by the rhythms they had always known. They rose with the sun, worked while the light lasted, and came together in the evenings to share news and bread. The rules could shape the edges of life, but the heart of it, the tending of land, the raising of children, the care for neighbors, was beyond the reach of any proclamation. So the new laws became part of the landscape, as much a part of the world as the hedgerows and the lanes. They were read aloud, discussed, sometimes ignored, sometimes obeyed. They were another sign that the world was no longer the same, and yet that it was still turning, carrying its people into whatever the next season would bring. In the years just after the plague, many towns seemed to hold their breath. Streets once filled with the chatter of merchants and the clatter of carts lay quiet. Wooden shutters stayed closed, not because of fear any longer, but because there was little reason to open them. Weeds took root in the cracks between stones, and moss softened the edges of steps where no one's feet had passed in months. Yet, as the seasons turned and more people ventured into these empty spaces, a slow stirring began, not a sudden burst of activity, but a gentle, deliberate mending. At first, the changes were almost invisible. A broken window replaced here, a fallen beam lifted there. In many places, work was done not by large crews, but by pairs of neighbors or families, their voices low as they measured and hammered. A cart might be seen rolling in from the countryside carrying rough planks, or a mason's tools bundled together in a cloth. Even the sound of work was muted compared to the past, as though the town itself was still waking from a long and uneasy sleep. Market squares were among the first places to be tended. The stalls had been left to weather and rot during the worst years, their roofs sagging under rainwater, their counters warped by sun and frost. But slowly, new boards were laid, fresh thatch was tied down, and the smell of sawdust joined the scent of baking bread from the few ovens that still worked. At first, only a handful of traders returned. The baker, the potter, a farmer with eggs and onions, but each week another stall would open. The square, once echoing with emptiness, began to hum softly against town walls, where they existed, also drew attention. Gaps where stones had fallen were filled again, not in haste, but with careful hands. Weeds were cleared from the base, and the wooden gates, long unbarred, were mended so they could close at night. These repairs were as much about comfort as about defense. The sight of a whole wall standing firm reassured those within that the town was not crumbling away, but holding fast against time. In the narrow streets, homes that had been shut for years were opened once more. Sometimes the air inside was stale and the hearth cold, but a broom across the floor, a fire lit in the grate, and the quiet murmur of a family settling in sin made it a home again. Windows were propped open, letting in the smell of rain or baking from the neighbor's oven. Children's voices began to echo faintly between the walls, chasing one another down the lanes. Not all buildings could be saved. Some had sagged beyond repair, their timbers soft, their roofs fallen in. In these cases, the remains were carefully cleared. The space sometimes left open for a garden, sometimes rebuilt from the ground up. A few towns used these clearings as meeting places, planting flowers or leaving benches where people could sit in the sun. These new spaces, though born of loss, became places for quiet gathering, where the hum of conversation replaced the silence that had once hung so heavily. Tradesmen, who had left in the worst years, sometimes returned to find their workshops dusty but intact. The blacksmith might find his anvil where he had left it, waiting for the ring of hammer on metal to fill the air again. The weaver might find his loom needing only a few new threads before the shuttle could pass back and forth. These small revivals brought life not only to the town's economy, but to its spirit. The work of hands was a reminder that people could make and mend, even after so much had been lost. The riverside towns, in particular, felt the change keenly. Barges began to move along the water again, bringing salt, wool, or timber from places that had seemed impossibly far during the quiet years. The creak of ropes and the slap of water against the hulls were familiar sounds, returning like old friends. Dockside inns reopened their doors, the smell of ale and stew drifting into the street, drawing in traders and locals alike. Even the small touches mattered. A sign repainted and swinging above a shop, a patch of bright cloth hanging from a window, a lantern lit at a doorway in the early dusk, each one a signal that life was returning. These signs were noticed, and they spread. When one family painted their shutters, the neighbor did the same. When a baker added honey cakes to her counter, the potter brought out new jugs, glazed in warm colors. The changes might have been small, but they gathered like drops of rain filling a bucket, and so town by town, the rebuilding was not just of stone and wood, but of trust, of habit, of the simple belief that tomorrow would be worth preparing for. The pace was gentle, the work steady. The streets that had once felt like echoes of themselves now began to sound, faintly at first, with the same music of daily life that had played there before the plague. The rhythm of footsteps, the rise and fall of voices, the closing of doors at night. The towns were becoming themselves again, not all at once, but with the patience of people who knew that time could heal as surely as hands could build, even as towns and villages began to mend, and the rhythm of life slowly returned. There remained an unspoken understanding that the world was now shaped by absence. Every street, every field, every stretch of road seemed to carry a shadow of those who had once walked there. It was not a shadow of fear that had long since lifted, but a shadow of memory. And though people did not speak of it every day, they carried their own ways of remembering the ones they had lost dot in the churchyards. The gravestones told part of the story. Some were marked with names and dates, the letters still sharp in the stone. Others had only faint traces left, the weather wearing away what had once been clear. Families would come in the quiet hours, often at the turn of the seasons, to brush away moss or lay a sprig of flowers by a stone. There was no great ceremony to these visits, only the slow, thoughtful work of clearing away leaves, straightening a marker, or lighting a small candle that would burn through the dusk. Many preferred to remember not in a churchyard, but in the places where life had been shared. A father might tell a story at the hearth about how his brother had once played a clever trick during the harvest. A mother might show her children the scarf their grandmother had woven years before, running her fingers over the worn threads as she spoke. These stories were not always told with sadness. Often they brought a small, quiet smile, a reminder that the ones gone had lived fully, that they had laughed and worked and sung before their time ended. Sometimes the remembering took the shape of work. A field might be tended because it had been someone's pride, or a bench mended because it had been someone's favorite place to sit. These acts of care, though simple, felt like conversations carried on in the language of the living. The fields grew tall with grain, the bench stood sturdy again, and in their way, both seemed to answer back dot in certain villages. The memory of the lost was woven into the year itself. On a chosen evening, often at harvest, when the air was mild and the work was done, candles would be set along the lanes. Each light was for someone remembered, and as the villagers walked through the glow, the names would be spoken softly, as though carried on the warm air. Children who had never met the ones being named would listen closely, learning the faces and stories of people who belonged to them through memory alone. Even the land seemed to hold remembrance. An orchard might grow wild because no one had the heart to cut down the trees planted by a loved one. A gate might sag, left untouched because it had been built by careful hands now gone. Nature, too, became a keeper of memory, letting ivy trace the outlines of abandoned cottages, or wildflowers bloom in places once walked every day. These sights, though tinged with absence, were not bitter. They were gentle reminders that life leaves traces that outlast it. Some remembrance was shared between communities. When a traveling peddler came through, He might speak of people from another village telling how a cousin had done well in a new home, or how a certain family still spoke of an old friend with fondness. In this way, the stories crossed hills and rivers, keeping the connections alive even when the faces were gone. Memory became a bridge, linking not only the past to the present, but one place to another. The church played its part too. Certain prayers were spoken at set times of year, asking for peace for all souls departed. Bells were rung slowly and evenly, their sound carrying over a rooftop and fields, reminding all who heard that the living and the dead still shared the same ground. The steady tone of the bell seemed to gather the town together for a moment, each person pausing in their own way to think of someone absent. For the children born after the plague, these acts of remembrance were their first understanding of history. They grew up knowing that there had been a time when the world was fuller, and that those who had gone were still present in the stories, the objects and the habits of the living. They learned to speak certain names with care and to listen closely when an elder's voice grew softer in the telling, and so memory became not a burden but a part of the fabric of life. It was a quiet thread, sometimes hidden, sometimes shining in the light of a candle or in the telling of a well-worn tale. The rebuilding of homes, the tending of fields, the return of markets, all these things carry forward the life that had been before. And in the gentle work of remembering, people found that those they loved had not vanished entirely, but lived on in the rhythms, the places, and the voices of a changed but enduring world. The years after the plague had begun, in silence, moved through slow repair, and now found themselves in a gentler rhythm. The England that emerged was not the same as the one that had been before, yet it had a quiet steadiness that felt, in its own way, whole. Fields lay broader and less crowded. Villages, though smaller, had a closeness among their people that was born from shared survival. The sound of life, footsteps, distant voices, the creak of cartwheels was no longer rare. It was simply there, part of each day's turning dot in the mornings, smoke curled from chimneys again, rising into the soft sky. The scent of bread might drift from one lane to another, carried on the breeze. Cocks crowed in the yards, and the lowing of cattle echoed across the pasture. Children could be seen running errands or walking together to the smaller schools that had taken root in the years after the worst. Though they were fewer in number than in their parents' youth, they seemed to fill the spaces between houses with an energy that hinted at the future. Work followed the seasons as it always had, though with fewer hands to do it. Men and women labored side by side in the fields, and the pace was unhurried. There was more land to tend than people to tend it, but there was also more space, more air, more quiet moments to stand and watch the light change over the hedgerows. In the evenings, tired but not hurried, they returned home to the warmth of the hearth, to meals simple but plentiful. Over time, people began to gather again in celebration. The first feasts after the plague were small, with tables not as crowded as they once had been, but there was more food for each person. Laughter returned slowly, rising first in short bursts, then in longer, warmer spells. These gatherings marked the turning of the year, the harvest brought in, and the promise of another season to come. Governments, seeing the change in work and wages, tried to shape the new order with laws, setting limits on pay, on the movement of laborers, on the buying and selling of property. These rules were read aloud in village squares, the words carrying into the cool air, though their reach was sometimes limited. In the spaces between what was written and what was lived, people quietly found their own ways forward. Towns themselves began to take on new life. Walls were repaired, streets cleared of weeds, shops reopened with fresh goods on display. The smell of bread baking returned to the lanes, and the sound of hammers echoed from workshops. Barges moved again along the rivers, and inns by the docks filled with the hum of traders and travelers. Little by little, the signs of a living town, a painted sign swinging in the breeze, a lantern lit in the evening. A door propped open to the sun reappeared. Through all this, memory lingered. Families tended gravestones, told stories by the fire, and kept objects that held meaning. a scarf, a tool, a favorite chair. In some villages, candles were lit each year to honor the lost, their names spoken softly in the glow. These acts of remembrance were not heavy with grief, but carried a gentle respect, a recognition that the past still lived quietly in the present. Over time, these memories became part of the new life taking shape, not a shadow over it, but a thread within it, and so England settled into its new shape, smaller, quieter, but steady. The fields grew, the rivers ran, the bells rang out. The seasons turned, as they always had, from blossom to harvest to frost and back again. The people who remained and the children who came after learned to live in a world with more space, more stillness, and a deeper understanding of how fragile and precious the everyday could be. Life did not return to what it had been, but it grew into something that could endure, carrying forward both the memory of loss and the quiet promise of days yet to come.